Hello, everyone. Welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights here with Charlie Araujo. How are you today, Charlie?
I am great. It's a beautiful day here in New York. It is hot. It's just been I think we missed the nice summer part or like the early summer where it's supposed to be warm but not too hot, and we went straight to the hot. But other than that, it's all good. My Mets are on this horrible losing spell. It's just miserable. I was all dressed up for our last episode. They lost that game. It was a good
hmm
game at least, but still, it's always a good day at the ballpark. But that's just the summer. I guess not the doldrums, but the summer vibe is always a little bit different, and I think we're in the swing of it. How about you?
Yeah, but that's just the Mets. Like every April, the Mets start out in first place. If they had the World Series after April, like the Mets would be there half the time. They're outstanding in April, and then sometime in mid-June, they all just die. And I don't.
I I personally think it's me because it's like both my teams or my first team, my main team or historically main team anyway, is the Angels. And I turned it on last night because it's like I got my little alert on my phone because I was busy doing stuff. It's like, oh, they're tied up in the ninth. It's going to extra innings. I go, this is great. I turned it on. It's the top of the 11th. Literally, the moment I turn it on, forgot who we were playing. They score 3 runs and the Angels lose. It's like, okay, I just need to like ignore it. If I stop going and stop watching, then maybe they'll win. But yeah, whatever.
Yeah, the Angels are really great at taking generational talents and wasting them. Mike Trout, Shohei, Albert Pujols. It's like,
Well, do you have anything nice to say about my teams? My gosh.
well, the Angels were great at getting that talent. They're just not so great at using them for anything.
Yes, there we go. All right, maybe we should talk about some technology instead of baseball. My goodness.
Wow. What? Yeah. Why would you want to change the topic, Charlie? I don't understand.
All right. Well, talking about teams, in some ways, I feel like technology is a little bit like baseball, and that we have like these major players that are just going at it, and every day you have a sort of the pendulum swings one way or the other. And so we have a bunch of interesting news, and pretty much we're talking about a lot of the usual suspects today. We're going to be talking about Salesforce and Anthropic and OpenAI and SAP, and so a lot of the usual suspects. And one of the pieces of news was that Salesforce, right actually as we were recording last week's episode, announced Agentforce 3. And I don't know that I would characterize any of the things in this particular release as being all out groundbreaking. To me, there were two things. One is there lots of focus on interoperability, on governance, on things that we talked about as being the big bugaboos going forward. So not surprising, but also very necessary. Um, but probably the thing that I find most interesting is this product is what, just over a year old, something like that. And here
Mhm.
we are on the third release, and the rate of innovation, particularly for a product that by all accounts, I mean, I know they're talking like having 8,000 customers or something, but in practice, at least from what we can tell, it's still in the very, very early stages of adoption, where it's not like this is being driven by customers and the demand. So I found that interesting, and what that might mean in terms of the state of the industry. So I don't know, what was your take on this particular announcement?
Yeah, agents are a wild topic right now because I feel like everybody's using agents to mean something different. Your company, of course, has their agents. The company I will be going to, but can't announce yet, also is working on its own agentic strategy. But first of all, we're kind of confused on whether to talk about agents as basic workflow automation or predefined actions, or whether they're autonomous and able to work by themselves or able to work with other agents, right? So there's already this first piece mess. And then the extent to which these agents can interact with other agents, other data sources, other systems, and how open those agents are is a question as well. And I feel like part of what Agentforce has been doing, Salesforce has been doing with these Agentforce versions, is reacting to each additional tier of maturity that we've been creating. So this tier of maturity, Agentforce 3, was really about looking at agentic interactions through things like the Anthropic Model Context Protocol, as well as creating its own control tower, which Agentforce is calling, I believe, a command center.
Command center. Yeah.
Yes. And most of these announcements are going to be happening, honestly, in July and August, but they're announcing it now before July 4th. And then the summer doldrums happen, which is just a smart marketing thing to do. And then hopefully, when we all come back for school and work in September, all of this will be magically built.
Yeah, I think what I think is, and I guess look, this will be the proof will be in the pudding as this rolls out. But I do think that's a valid assessment that this is the sort of evolution of maturity. The only thing that I would argue is it's the evolution of maturity of thought more than it is of practice. That
Mm-hmm.
I think that as people are beginning to, in earnest, think through both customers and the industry as a whole, thinking through MCP, I think is a great example of this, right? How it's evolving and it's mostly as people start thinking through how we're going to deploy this, they're recognizing we have these parts that are missing or parts we have to fix. But it's more about that thought exercise and about getting the product sort of ready than it is that, oh, we have customers that have deployed this and are hitting these roadblocks. Right. I think the deployment
Yeah.
process, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later with some comments by Jerome Powell, the Fed chair. I think this is really the part that's coming to a head, and that I think that the one thing I'm sort of worried for the industry overall is that we are so far. I feel like the software community is so far ahead of customers in terms of the actual deployment of most of this technology that there's this mismatch, and that I
It's
think
true.
is it's just a function of the speed. It's just this is a pace that we've never seen in terms of the development of a technology sector. So it's really really interesting.
Yes, I think from a practical perspective, CIOs are currently trying to figure out, how do I build an agent and then how do I trust that agent? And you have to get to that initial trust before you can even start thinking about agentic orchestration and agencies of autonomous agents working together and producing the benefits that are being promised to us at a high level around being able to replace, even call it 1% of jobs, much less 10% or 20% with
We're going to talk
agents.
about that more later
Yeah.
today too. Yeah. So one of the other thing I think is that's interesting about this is that perhaps unlike any other technology before it, particularly agentic AI solutions are really
Mm-hmm.
sort of an amalgamation of a whole bunch of different technologies that are all sort of cutting edge, all relatively new, and frankly, not fully baked themselves. So one of the things, when you start thinking about agentic AI solutions, you're dealing with workflow automation, you're dealing with cloud services and multiple cloud providers and the whole multi-cloud sort of scenarios. You're thinking about security and privacy constraints and all the compliance around it. And so much of this is still stuff that we've been for the last decade been sort of maturing and sorting out, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not fully baked. And in fact, we had a couple of these things sort of coming to a head around AI also this week. So one of them is that there's this ongoing lawsuit with the New York Times and OpenAI about their use of data that they've been basically using all the New York Times. What New York Times is claiming that they've been illegally or unfairly using all of their content to train their models. And there's been sort of a great ironic ruling from this judge because as part of this lawsuit, OpenAI is being told to effectively retain all of their interactions, all of these prompts, all of the stuff that under normal GDPR type compliance regulations, users should have the right to be forgotten. And so you sort of have this era where, or this space and time where they're now sort of in conflict. And this is sort of what I'm talking about. It's like things that we're still figuring out from a cloud perspective and a SaaS perspective, things like GDPR are now suddenly coming to a head in this AI era where none of it is clear and simple, and we're trying to sort out what to make of it. And this one was one I had to read it when you send this over. I read it 3 times. It's like, oh, this is just mind blowing. It's like, how do you how do we reconcile this?
Yes. Right now, OpenAI is being sued by the Times to retain conversations. And OpenAI is between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, obviously, companies like the New York Times have enough money to be able to throw at a legal case like this and continue pursuing it over time. So OpenAI, that even bothers a company as rich as OpenAI. But at the same time, you have these GDPR being the most prominent example of that, uh, saying that users should be allowed to be forgotten or erased from a system. And OpenAI actually wants to be compliant with that as well. Right now, they can't be. So they have to choose between data retention versus AI, I guess, evidence and lineage, and there's no one right answer at all. And when you multiply these conflicts by countries, by states, by regions, by
All
industries,
these different, yeah.
yeah, it's gonna get really messy, and we're just starting.
Well, and it also, I mean, in fact, they make some reference, and OpenAI published a statement on this, and they sort of made a reference about it as well. But there's also the other sort of underlying component in that even complying, it's not as simple as saying, oh, well, you know, if you're an AI company, you need to comply with GDPR or any of the other privacy compliance rules, because the reality is it's not the same. We're not, this isn't as simple as what these laws were envisioned for, where we had a system of record, you had data in it, and you want to be able to go to the company and say, hey, I don't want my data in there anymore, eliminate me. And that was a fairly simple, straightforward process. When we're talking about training models, and by the way, it's not even just training models. You know, we are actually evaluating this right now about what are our compliance requirements and what do we have to be able to deal with. And we're not training models, but we still have countless logs when we have these interactions going on, and we're using those as referential points as we're continually improving our own responses and interactions. And so there's like all these different dimensions. This is not easy stuff, and this is sort of what I was saying. It's like it's all sort of colliding, and we didn't have it all figured out coming in, and now it's just being multiplied. And so we're gonna be in this continued era where it is challenging to sort out. And coming all the way back to why this is important from a CIO's perspective, well, none of these cases, and we're going to talk about another one here in a second, none of these cases are directly calling out the consumers, meaning like an enterprise that may be using any of this. It is not a big stretch to say, well, that's the next downstream potential target if you are aware of these judgments and not also adhering or holding accountable, right? And so that's the question mark. So the other big case, and you can tie these together, is there is I guess you probably should summarize it, because it was a mixed decision on a case brought against Anthropic, and this one had to do with like the privacy. So sort of related, right? Insofar as this was brought against Anthropic and saying that they had unfairly pulled in a bunch of pirated content and had used it to train their models. And what's interesting about this particular case is the judge effectively said, as long as it's being used to train the model, then that's fair use. But if it's being used to library it and therefore surface that content directly, that's not fair use. And that was one of those where it's like clear as mud. Okay.
Yes.
and
So
and you know,
so this case in question is Bart's versus Anthropic, one of many cases out there where authors are suing model makers for using their content. And there were two parts to this copyright case. One is Anthropic allowed to use copyrighted material to train a model? And the second is whether it was allowed to use pirated content to be able to make the model. And the case from the Northern District of California basically decided that if Anthropic or Meta or anybody else had bought the book, they are allowed to use it for training purposes. If they did not actively purchase the book and used a data source that had pirated the information, they are liable to lawsuits. So the challenge here is that there is a data set called Books 3 that basically every model company has used: OpenAI, Anthropic, Meta, across the board. They used it to train their models, and nobody paid for those books at the end of the day. They just downloaded all those 180,000 books or whatever it is. And then, so now they are up for potential liability, and that might mean additional costs. And from the CIO's perspective, most model providers have been providing indemnity for use of their models, but their cost structure might be going up as they settle these lawsuits. So at the very least, you might be looking for added prices associated with using the models, which might affect you. At worst case scenario might be that you might start seeing these other kind of protections starting to go away as the model makers start saying that it's too expensive for them to support.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you know, for good or for bad, the situation I think is that we're pretty much through this process. So it's like this is all sort of retroactive, meaning the training is all done. There's, you know, one of the challenges we've had is there's very little information left for them to go suck up to train models any further. So that's why we're starting to shift to things like, you know, model generated data to train, you know, and which has its own issues. And so the question really is, well, where does that leave it? And I think it's sort of a big open. I think I agree with you. If I'm a CIO, I'm not that worried about it. I think that this is going to fall on the big model makers. But you know, I think the where I do think there's reason to be aware is that one of the things that we're, I think, finally getting to the point where this is going to start becoming more mainstream is this idea of fine tuning models, of creating your own small language models or fine tuning a model using your content. And in theory, that should be controlled. You should, you know, generally speaking, if you're fine tuning or if you're using some of these other techniques, you're going to be using information that is within your own data ecosystem, i.e., that you control. But frankly, most CIOs have never had to really worry about, is this first party data, third party data. They've never had to really focus that much on the governance of it because it really hasn't been an issue. And I think it could open up some doors. So, you know, we'll see. I think that as these suits get settled, we'll have greater clarity. But I also think as this one showed, it's not going to be a quick process, and we're going to have a lot of mixed feedback as we go through the court system here.
Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine that these lawsuits are far from over. Just to name one example in the analyst world we know so well, Gartner. It is very hard for me to imagine Gartner willingly giving up any rights to use its papers to train any model. If Gartner finds out about this, they will sue. They will protect their intellectual property to the nth degree because they will see that as a foundational threat to their business. And they are a multi-billion-dollar company. So just one example of the types of companies that will push hard to protect their IP and their data from any sort of model training.
Yeah, no doubt. But the trick with it as well is, and I don't think Gartner has released this, but I know, I won't name them, but a few other analyst firms have been toying with sort of model-based approaches to interact with their content. And let's call a spade a spade. Guess what those systems are using? They're not developing their own models. They're using one of these large models that are out there, which means they're benefiting from all of it. And this is why it's going to be this, you know, swirling pot that is going to be really difficult to suss out over time. And yeah, we'll see. All right. So I realized we could have done this next story at the end, but I guess we'll talk about it now. It's maybe a nice break from the lawsuits. So one of the other pieces of industry news is that Google has introduced, as part, you know, Gemini is their big AI tool, and has introduced something quite fascinating in that it is a CLI, or command line interface version of an AI tool. And I had to go look. It's like I literally couldn't even process it. It's like, what does that even mean? And at least as I'm understanding it, it's literally while you're in the command line, that you can actually, I guess there's some kind of a denotation to trigger it, but you can basically interact with Gemini directly from the command line. Now, what's interesting about this is very clearly a play at developers and at the enterprise, because most people today don't use command line interfaces unless you are pretty technical at this point. And so this is clearly targeting that audience. And so it was sort of a harkening back to a day. I mean, even most developers don't use a whole lot of command line. So it's really kind of, I mean, what was your take on this? Why are they doing this?
Well, I love how the hype around Gemini that Google puts around creating a Gemini command line interface is positioning itself for the next decade. And nothing says going to the future like the command line interface, CLI, that we grew up with, 40 years ago or whatever. But I think that outside of that, like you said, it's about the developers. Anthropic has already done a good job of providing Claude via CLI, and it's a good way for developers to be able to quickly test models and to iterate, as well as to provide a common interface for for working with models and being able to get quick calls back. And there's always going to be a need for this foundational interface, whether it's the CLI or whether it's a CSV file. You want to have basic text and model and interface capabilities that you can work at a low level to be able to support experimentation. So I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm not as excited about it as Google is, but I see the
Well,
necessity.
what I find interesting about it as well is, and this is, I think we can take a couple of things from this. I mean, one, we've talked about the ubiquity of AI that is literally going to seep into everything, and I think this is an example of that. That
Mhm.
AI will cease to be a product and barely even a feature. It'll simply just be a fundamental way that we execute and interact with our technology. It is getting rapidly to, and I've always loved this scene from Star Trek. If you remember back when it was the first Star Trek crew and they did the first set of movies, and they went back in time, and he was trying to interact with the computer by talking to it, like it had an AI interface, and the guy hands him the mouse and he holds the mouse up like, oh my gosh, I have to use it as a microphone because he thought he
Uh,
had to talk clearly. And I mean, I think we're rapidly reaching this point where AI is simply the ubiquitous way in which we interact with all of our technology. And I think this is an example of that, ironically enough, even when it's this very low level of interaction. But the other part I find really fascinating about this is that it's happening the exact same time we have this whole rise of vibe coding, which is moving the entire 180 degrees away from this idea of doing any coding at all, creating apps simply via prompt, and how somehow these simultaneously coexist. And I think that if I have a frustration with how people talk about AI and its application, they tend to talk in these sort of single streams, like it's all one direction. And the reality is we're seeing this. We're seeing all of this stuff happening all at once, simultaneously, and it's about sorting it all out and making sense of it all. So that was kind of my big takeaway as I chuckled at it, because I almost never use a command line interface for anything any longer, and so it's definitely a subset of folks that this is appealing to.
yeah, it's definitely becoming a very bifurcated split in the developer world. Everybody used to using libraries is now doing vibe coding, and then you have people doing the actual foundational work and having to create new and novel code and capabilities at a very deep level, CLI level, and assembly level. And yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure how that gap is going to be bridged at this point because it seems like it's just two completely different separate directions.
I guess we will see. Well, speaking of we will see, and as this continues to evolve, one of our favorite companies to talk about, SAP, they they did sort of an interesting thing, and I don't know that I'm going to be too hard on this, because I think this is it's a very valid challenge, and I think we're going to see a lot of this sorting out. We talked about this, I think, a week or two ago. I don't even
Mhm.
remember, but we were quoting the fact that anybody says they've got the price. I think we were talking about Salesforce at the time. Anyone who has the pricing for AI worked out is lying. And I think we're seeing that, right? AI is incredibly difficult across every dimension, figuring out the use cases, figuring out usage, the consumption costs are high. We don't have the same benefits of scale that we did with the cloud. In fact, it can grow, not go the other way. So you have all these factors. And so organizations are rightfully trying to sort it out, and they're trying to balance between the effort to drive adoption, while managing against the sort of, wanting to control for the unknowns. So anyway, with all of that as sort of background, SAP has introduced I guess a rebranding is the best way to say this, of one of their offerings. And there's a bunch of different moving parts to it. I mean, SAP's pricing schemas are always extremely complex, and it's always very difficult to get your head around. And like most of their major competitors like this, like we talked about Broadcom, lots of bundling going on where they're packaging up a bunch of things. So there's all of that. And so I don't want to minimize this, that there's a whole lot of moving parts to this particular rebranded repackaging. But one of the most interesting points is they, for all intents and purposes, pulled out all of their AI components out of these bundles, and basically eliminated the ability to sort of get the all you can eat stuff. And now all the AI pieces, at least as I'm understanding it, are add-ons. Um, And what I'm curious about is that because they were seeing consumption skyrocket? I mean, we have not talked a whole lot about SAP's, huge AI adoption, um, or if this is preemptive, or I mean, I don't know if you have any insight, but that I found interesting. So I have some opinions about where this is all going from an overall pricing standpoint. But and what's your take on this news more broadly?
Yeah, at a broad perspective for SAP customers, they've been pitched on Rise with SAP for a while as a way to modernize SAP, and now as they are starting to use Rise with SAP as more of a generalized market phrase, they have repackaged SAP accordingly. And as you mentioned, one of the things I did find most interesting was how they are taking out their AI units uh, from the packaging and providing that on a per use basis. And I think this reflects the challenge of pricing for AI. Software companies are tempted to want to provide a bucket where you can get unlimited usage because that's where the market tends to go anyways, as you charge for your $20 a month, $100 a month, whatever. It's not like you meter your Salesforce usage or other SaaS usage. For instance, you just buy your license and use it basically at this point, or your cell phone plan. You basically buy it and you use it for X dollars a month. So that is the temptation. But the problem is the variability of AI usage is still at the point where we're not quite sure how big that bucket is or how to control those usage trends. So now it looks like SAP is going back to the cost plus foundational model, which is kind of what you do when you want to make a profit on something, but you don't know how much anybody's going to use. And of course, the problem there is that you can't predict your bill. Just like once upon a time, we used to all pay 25 cents per minute for long distance calls. And like, how much does it cost to call your mom per month? You don't know because you don't know how long those conversations are going to last. Now we've got the same problem with AI.
Yeah, well, and I do think, like you said, I think it's interesting because in fact, that's what it was in reference to the Salesforce. Because last week or the week before, we talked about the fact that Salesforce went the other direction. They had been usage based and went to a fixed monthly fee for this. And it is because I know when I was on the other side, I spent most of my career on the other side of the table. The thing I hated the most was the unpredictability. And if you look at cloud is interesting. It is right. It sort of reconditioned the world into looking at the world from this idea of consumption. The difference is that those were IT controlled, generally speaking, IT controlled workloads, which meant that IT had the ability to sort of control the operating parameters and therefore create a degree of predictability, at least after a certain point, right? Maybe there was a transitionary period where you had to kind of get the workload into production and to see what it was performing, align it to business motions, right? Oh, well, month end close causes these spikes, and we can model it out and you could get a sense. And then the usage worked in your favor as a CIO because then you had the benefits of elasticity where you could spin up and have that benefit without having to worry about it and not pay for more than you wanted. Because what the one part that you didn't say in there is that the way a software company manages that risk of having a all you can eat price is we build that buffer, we build that elasticity into the pricing model, right? So that we cover our downside risk. And so theoretically, a consumption-based model, if modeled properly, is actually cheaper for a consumer, right? But as you love to do with the whole FinOps thing, is those cloud costs became a real issue because it requires discipline of being able to get that visibility of understanding what those usage models look like, so you can actually create the degree of predictability that you need. And so AI is sort of stuck between between these two worlds, right? It's on the one hand, you have this consumption model of cloud, and on the other hand, a consumption interface, much like a SaaS product, which is like you said, sold typically as an all you can eat. And we're trying to figure out how to bundle those two together and make these live. And it's not a simple equation. And so I think I don't think, this is why I'm not being hard on SAP on this. I think that we're going to see software companies across the board go back and forth to try to figure out both a combination of where the market is going, but also where their customers are and what those use cases are, right? The more predictable the use case, the easier it is well, ironically, the more predictable the use case, the easier it is on both sides. It's easier for the customers to create their own predictability, and it's easier for the software company to do it. So then it's just a question of who's taking the risk. So I think
Mhm.
it's a fascinating thing, and I think if I'm a CIO, I'm looking at this as a sign of the times to come, that we're going to see this sort of ping ponging back and forth a lot.
Yeah, the big paradox about AI is that it's most useful when you're having problem defining the problem. Like it is good at these unknown unknowns that we deal with, but that also means you can't know beforehand how much something is going to cost to solve the problem because you literally are having trouble defining the challenge in the first place.
Well, and I think we also haven't decided, and again, there's probably not a single answer to this, but we haven't decided if the primary use of AI is to have it be an exponential tool where we stick it in the hands of an employee, and the more they use it, the more productive they get, the better they become.
Mm-hmm.
Or are we using AI as a tool that allows us to reduce our workforce, and therefore it has this sort of negative curve on it, right? Where we actually see the usage drop because we in fact have people using it less because it's so
Mm-hmm.
much more effective and more powerful to get the job done. Relative to everything. And I don't know if there is a single answer. I think we're going to see both. We're going to talk here in a second about on our next story about some of the claims that are going about how effective people have been at using AI. But I think we are still very much at the stage where we have more unknowns than we have knowns. And as a result, I think we're going to keep seeing this flip flopping as companies try to figure it out. And as the buyers try to flip it out, because let's also call a spade a spade. If every buyer said, "Oh heck no, you better give me an all you can eat single price," then SAP would never do this, right? So
Right.
this is clearly saying that we have Salesforce going one direction, SAP going the other. These are two giant companies serving effectively the exact same market, and what just that tells you is the market is not yet clear on what they want.
Mm-hmm.
So. Okay, so the other, I alluded to it a second ago, the other interesting news, and I think certainly is telling or useful as an input as if you're a CIO, is where was this at? But the U.S. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, was he talking at an event? Yes.
Speaking
Oh, he
to
was
the
testifying,
Senate Banking Committee, yes. Mm-hmm.
and he, as far as I know, I think this is the first time he's really, in any substantive way, weighed in on the impact of AI. I don't know. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, like the Jerome Powell, he's the chair of the Federal Reserve. He's been in Federal Reserve and Treasury jobs across administrations for quite a while now after being an investment banker. So he definitely understands how money flows. And normally his opinions are mostly around things like monetary policy, monetary flows, and understanding how that affects inflation and economic macroeconomic rates that affect the American economy. Frankly, pretty nonpartisan and non-political stuff.
But he hasn't really done a whole lot of weighing in on the impact of AI, right?
Not
Publicly.
really, and AI
Yeah.
has not been a big issue for him, frankly, because it's not his thing normally.
So to me, there's like three big bullet points in his statements, right? The first is he basically said the current impact of AI on the economy and the labor market is limited. And of course, if you are watching the show or reading the tech news, you're like, what? Are you kidding me? I mean, it's all everyone talks about, billions and billions. But, from his view at a macroeconomic level, looking at the markets, I think that's a really important and telling statement, a grounding for all of us to remember that right now, the actual impact of all of this on our economy is limited.
Mm-hmm.
But then the second thing he says, however, its capabilities are his, in quote, enormous. And that is not a word that he throws around often, and will eventually drive significant change. So he's saying right now, don't believe all the hype. It is nowhere near having all this impact. Part two, believe the hype. It's going to have a massive impact, right? It's going to have significant change. Part three, don't believe the hype because it's going to take a long time. This sort of widespread innovation and adoption often happens much more slowly than we expect. So to me, it was like, this is like a big truth telling machine. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
we have all this hype out there and he sort of like lays it out that, what to believe and what not to believe. And I think that's super, super useful. And I think it actually rings, from my perspective anyway, rings really, really true.
Yes, and I think this is also important because the federal chair probably has the most nuanced job in all of the government, frankly. And this started back in the Alan Greenspan days, kind of with the Clinton administration, where every single word that Greenspan would say would literally move markets. If he said there was a significant change versus a sufficient rate change, like that in and of itself would make the stock market go crazy. And that is this job that Powell has. So Jerome Powell picks his words pretty carefully when he's taking on any sort of topic, and he respects that position. And he is very careful with his words in response, as is has everybody in this position in my adult life, at least. They've been extremely careful about what they say from a media perspective. So the fact that he is pointing out that AI is not a significant driver for the economy yet, and that he warns about the challenges of using technology and in adopting technology going forward, I think is significant, showing where is AI really from a big picture perspective. When we in the tech world can get extremely caught up in talking about 20, 30, 50% of jobs just being wiped out willy-nilly, as Anthropic CEO Dario Modi basically said just a little while ago, something like 50% of all entry-level jobs would be wiped out by AI. It's interesting to see Powell saying, no, that's not really happening yet. We don't really see any evidence that that is about to happen imminently.
Yeah, and he pointed out again very pointedly that the uncertainty around it, right? Because that's the other part. He didn't say, "Oh, this is going to happen," and not that anyone can really predict this, but that he explicitly called out the uncertainty of understanding exactly when we hit that tipping point, when it
Mm-hmm.
actually starts having that major impact. And I think it runs counter to some of the narratives we're getting in the press right now. Interestingly, the same article from the Register highlighted some of these notes, that just this last week. So British Telecom announced that they are cutting 42% of their staff by 2030, claiming that it's all driven by AI ability to reduce headcount. Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, made all kinds of news last week because he was talking about how AI is presently today, right now in the present, handling 30 to 50% of the work in his company. Now he walked that back a little bit later, and I think he carved out specifically in engineering and support and a few other places.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I will also point out that Salesforce has not been reducing their staff. I mean, and I don't know that they're even necessarily showing growth outside of their employee capacity. So I don't know where that number is coming from. I really do question its efficacy and what it means. I mean, and look, I'm a believer. I'm a believer in the impact of all of this, but I'm super wary of the hype around it as well. And so that's why I really appreciated these sort of dissecting this into these three big points: where we're at
Mm-hmm.
today, what its potential is, and realistically how long it's going to take before we see that impact. And I guess the fourth piece is, and not really understanding what that is, right? It's probably gonna be slower than we expect, but we don't really know. And I think that's it's a classic or a really beneficial view if you're an enterprise IT leader to take and say, okay, this helps me frame where we're really at.
Yeah, I will say right now, I think that any company planning to cut 30% of the workforce is making a big mistake. I think they're going to quickly find out that they have continuity issues and governance issues that they were taking for granted, and that they haven't figured out a good long-term plan for having AI take over all of the, call it, commodity work that they think they're able to get done this quickly. I think that's overly aggressive, and we're going to see a couple of years from now the companies that made that dip having to either rehire or change their company in some way as a result. I think we're going to see some messy stories come out of this.
Well, I honestly think we're going to see a lot of non-stories. Like I would be willing to bet that if we were to follow BT on this, they don't follow through on it, because the practicalness of it is really challenging to manage. And
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I don't see it. I'm not saying eventually, but they said 2030. So in fairness, that's 5 years
Mm-hmm.
from now, right? 5 years in this era, I mean, ChatGPT didn't exist 5 years ago. So it's like, that is
We were
forever.
all locked down in our houses 5 years ago.
Right.
It's
It
like,
is
who knows?
forever. But I think maybe that's my biggest issue with this statement is that right now, I mean, I'm operating on an 18 month, and 18 months out, I have trouble. It is incredibly fuzzy 18 months out right now,
Mhm.
right? When we're looking at our kind of, we talk really about strategic planning at this point. It's just, we are moving at breakneck pace. We're trying to create adaptability. We're trying to create elasticity in everything we do because it is changing so fast. And so
Yeah,
I think that's
you've
the
got
other
like
big
your one
warning
month
sign.
plan, your 3 month plan, and you have your optimistic 6 month plan. But honestly, you know that that 6 month plan is going to change a lot.
Yeah, it's changing so fast. So making a statement that 5 years from now, this is what it's going to be. To me, it's like this is an effort to just try to be relevant or to get in the news or whatever. And I get all that, I guess, but it's just I take it with a huge grain of salt.
Mhm.
And here's part of why. With our closing story, which we try to end on something light. This isn't really light, but it is, I guess, fun, sort of. At least if you're geeky like us, insofar as it leaves you scratching your head. So this is an article from Bloomberg talking about how ChatGPT is wowing office workers, i.e., enterprise workers that we cover, um, and that it's in contrast and at the expense of Microsoft, which of course famously has licensed OpenAI's models
Mhm.
to produce their Copilot product and has been going to market. And so the article goes through a whole bunch of sort of analysis around this and the competitive dynamics behind it, and basically saying how there's been a whole bunch of companies that started with Microsoft and are now finding that their employees prefer ChatGPT. And it's shocking for two reasons. First, by all accounts, and it's always hard because people don't disclose what they're actually paying, but by all accounts, ChatGPT is as much as twice as much as Microsoft Copilot. And Copilot is using the exact same model underneath the
Mhm.
covers that ChatGPT is, obviously, because they're both OpenAI. And so I was sitting here, and the article really doesn't do a great job of explaining why people like it better or what it is. I know you have a hypothesis you're going to share, but I found it bewildering. And so when we talk about why this is so tough, this makes zero sense. Like, why in the world is ChatGPT winning here, or at least anecdotally winning here? It just defies logic. And so anyone who says they've got the AI stuff figured out, it's like, yeah, okay, explain this one to me then.
Yeah, I find it super weird as well from a pure technical perspective, as we all know that Microsoft and OpenAI were basically married and joined at the hip a year ago when it came to AI strategy, and not that much has changed over the past year for their products to completely split off and become all that different. And also, I believe ChatGPT has higher price points overall. They've
Right.
experimented with extremely high price points up to $200 a month, I believe, per user, whereas Copilot tends to be cheaper, and you tend to be able to tweak things within your Microsoft contract if you really want something, and they're usually happy to give you all sorts of stuff for free as long as you sign up for your ongoing Windows contract going forward across your thousands of users. So there's all sorts of things that Microsoft can do that should theoretically be more attractive than OpenAI. And Microsoft has the apps that OpenAI doesn't have.
Right.
So, at first glance, it just doesn't make sense, right? Other than that, OpenAI's simply their UX, the way that you go into ChatGPT is well known, and it takes up your entire screen, and it provides more canvas for you to work with than the Copilot does, which is kind of stuck to the side of whatever app you're working with. That's literally the only difference that I can see between the two products that is all that meaningful for, call it, 80% of white collar workers.
Well, one of the things that's interesting that the article, I won't say it comes out and says it, but it alludes to the fact that part of the situation may simply be the fact that ChatGPT was so successful on getting that sort of mind share at a consumer level that, to your point, anybody could just go and use it on their own and go to the website and create an account for free and set it up, that it created this comfort level with it that it just felt more comfortable. And this, what's interesting about this is the consumerization of IT that I
Mhm.
actually wrote my first book around, because I saw that you had people like Apple and the iPhone and Facebook and introducing these technologies that were just a delight to use and super easy, and that the enterprise was behind. And so I think if there's one thing that this may speak to, is, we've talked about the fact that Microsoft has like what 130 or something co-pilots in market now, all these different flavors of it. It's integrated into everything, and so it's not this sort of really simple interface, right? It
True.
has that complexity, and so it does make me wonder if it's that same sort of function of that that consumerization that led to this sense of adoption that made people just more comfortable with it. um, it's just fascinating to me, and so I don't 100% know what to do with it, and I think it's clearly a warning sign for Microsoft. I mean, I certainly don't count them out, because I do think in the end, from an enterprise perspective, they're going to have a lot of traction from it, but um, I think the strategy here hasn't completely panned out. Which, by the way, the other part of the news we didn't talk about. Is that there's ongoing battles right now around the definition of AGI that have been
Mhm.
bubbling for a while, specifically because of this potential rift developing between Microsoft and OpenAI. Because, ironically enough, that's one of the clauses in the contract that allows OpenAI to get out of the relationship with Microsoft. So, yeah, this is going to be an interesting space to develop over the next, I was going to say a few years, but in this, that's like dog years. So maybe a few months. I don't know.
Yeah, I also wonder if Microsoft is showing that sometimes more isn't better. Maybe the best AI is a simple AI that has not had all these other Googles and doodads added on. That's technical enterprise technology speak for governance and context. But perhaps we've already reached peak AI usefulness from the model perspective, and ChatGPT reflects this is what is actually most useful, or at least most palatable for the average user at this point. And we don't have additional advances to make. Just like the iPhone quickly got to a certain form factor, and then after the first 4 or 5 iPhones, there hasn't really been that much of a change ever since, other than improving the camera over time.
Yeah, so one other thing, actually, you say that did strike me. One of the comments, and I almost dismissed it until you said this right now, and it just sort of triggered. One of the comments that one of the people that was interviewed for this article mentioned was that there was a lag, that
Mhm.
Microsoft, that a new development or a new feature in ChatGPT would often lag before it hit Copilot. And Microsoft's response, I think rightfully so, was that they had to go through a round of testing and validation to ensure that it was enterprise ready. And what I find interesting is that sort of implies, that was sort of a shot across the bow to OpenAI, that they are not making it enterprise ready. I don't know if that's true or not. But I do think there's something to be said. I mean, I have often talked about the fact that part of the challenge is that the enterprise tech stack is necessarily more complex. We need more governance. We need more controls. We need all of this ability to understand what's going on as we start talking about true agents rolling out. We do. There's a reason Salesforce made this announcement, and the reason ServiceNow has their
Mhm.
control tower. And all right, we need this ability to manage all of this in a cohesive, organized fashion. And any consumer oriented, that's always that price of the simplicity, which is why Apple, as an example, using going back to them, has always struggled to really make serious inroads in the enterprise. It took them a long time to
Yes.
be able to kind of get that level of control. So we'll see how this shapes out. I think it's going to be really fascinating to watch. But this article just sort of blew my mind. Just as I was reading through it, it was like,
Yes. Apparently, Coke and Pepsi are different, or Coke and Coke in this case. Coke and Coke with a different
exactly,
label like are apparently different. Microsoft Coke is different from Coke. That's what I've learned.
exactly.
Yes.
So, all right. Well, there we
And
go.
on that note, thank you so much for joining us for another This Week in Enterprise Tech. As always, if you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, comment, let us know what you thought and what you'd like for us to take on for next week. And till then, have a great week.